And moreover, it's extremely obvious to anyone who watches that this guy had direct connections to a foreign government. Now, no one's allowed to say that that foreign government is Israel because we have been somehow cowed into thinking that that's naughty.
So recently, Tucker Carlson did a speech at Turning Point USA regarding Epstein's ties to Israel and why he believes that Epstein himself was working on behalf of Israeli intelligence. Now, this is extremely interesting, especially because this speech is in front of lots of pro-Trump Republicans. So how they handle that is going to be quite interesting. Let's see what he has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So I noticed everyone's been talking about Epstein tonight, and I want to kind of differ from the crowd a little bit in saying that I watched Ben Shapiro yesterday, and now before you boo me, I thought he made a really solid point. He's like, it happened a long time ago. Who cares? And by the way, we should trust the government and whatever the bureaucrats tell us. And by the way, it's wrong to ask a lot of unauthorized questions. So I just want to go on the record to say that, no, to say I think that's absurd. And it's exactly the kind of thinking that I personally voted against in the last election. In the last election, I spent a lot of the month of October campaigning with and for the president. I voted for the president. I never vote for anybody generally. I know they're always telling you, you must vote or you can't have an opinion. Oh, shut up. I don't like to vote, but I did vote this time. And I don't like to vote because I don't believe in any of them. And this time I really felt like I know Trump well, I love Trump personally, and what we were looking at was just so awful and totalitarian and stupid. And it wasn't even the arguments that I disagreed with from the Kamala Harris. It's weird even to say her name now. Who was that exactly? It was like a bad dream.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about what Tucker's already revealed here, but the most striking thing to me is Ben Shapiro's response to this being so, categorically Ben Shapiro in every way. It's, utterly just dumbfounding that he's going to use the same lines that they fed us after the COVID regime to just not question the experts. You're a bunch of conspiracy theorists, use your cloth mask, use the 7-foot rule, and just trust the government. They have your best interests in mind. Well, Ben Shapiro was bad on the COVID issue. He's now bad on the Epstein issue. This is a bipartisan cover-up in which the previous statements of this administration are being just blatantly contradicted in so many ways. We've seen that play out. And he just doesn't have a modicum of curiosity as to why that might be the case. Same with Mark Levin, too. And Ben Shapiro's handling this a lot differently than some of the other right-wingers out there, particularly actual right-wing dissidents like Tucker Carlson, like Steve Bannon, like Matt Walsh are, totally questioning this narrative that they're throwing out here right now, which in my mind is kind of a plus. It is kind of a compliment to these people, showing that the entire MAGA movement is not as cultish as some of us may have thought prior to this.
But it wasn't even so much the arguments I disagreed with, though I definitely disagreed with the arguments. It was the style of argument that drove me completely bonkers, summarized most crisply by "shut up, racist." Whatever you said, it was "shut up, racist," and it's like, but wait, first of all, I'm not a racist, but that's not even the point. The point is, I just told you what I think. I just asked you an entirely legitimate question, mostly, what the hell are you doing? And rather than answer it, you didn't pay me the respect that you would a human being. You treated me like a slave or an animal by telling me to stop barking. Shut up, racist. And I won't put up with that because I'm not a slave or an animal. I'm an American citizen, an adult man who pays his taxes. So, I ask people questions for a living, and very often I get answers that I don't care for, that I disagree with, that I think are stupid, but at least they're answers.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to see the right flavor of woke, the red flavor of woke, just say anything critical of Israel. It's exactly as Tucker says. It's what's wrong with you, racist, but just the red flavor of it, instead of the blue flavor of it that we saw from all the wokeness from the liberals, in the last few years. And we still see it, although I do think that mentality has taken a hit. The woke mind virus is certainly not as popular as it was, 4 years ago. And part of it is because of how absurd this stuff is being exposed in front of mass audiences that just don't trust these standard narratives anymore. And you're seeing that from the Epstein case too. They'll call you kooks if you continue to ask questions about the inconsistencies in the government's tall tale. They'll call you conspiracy theorists if you happen to just point out the obvious things that are documented about Epstein and his connections to Israel. I've done that in a lot of other videos. If you do that, you're just, not worthy of consideration. And instead of actually arguing the merits of your position, you're just going to deflect and get out of that conversation by calling the opponent a racist. What do you know? We're seeing that again in the Epstein case, and Tucker's right about that.
At least the person responding is treating me like a human being with a soul created in the image of the Creator. He's paying me the respect that every human being is due. When you ask a direct question to someone in charge, you are due. That person is morally bound to give you an answer. He's not bound to agree with you, but he's bound to stop and answer your question. And the left never did that. They would dismiss you out of hand. You are not worth listening to. Be quiet. And that's, of course, where the impulse to censorship comes from. It comes from the belief that you don't deserve to speak because you're not fully human. They own you. And that's what I voted against above all. I voted against a million different things that I hated about the last administration. Their insane desire to start pointless wars around the world.
Yeah, amen to that. And I think Tucker's absolutely on fire here. That is the mentality they have, that they're above the law. They're not, bound to the same moral ethos and qualities that you and I would be. You're not, entitled to a response, even though they're ostensibly working for you, right? They're your representatives. In reality, of course, they're the representatives more so of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and JP Morgan and Pfizer. That's exactly who they're actually representing. And, just to even pretend there's actual representation even in Congress anymore, let alone senators who are just beholden to national lobbies every 6 years, come back maybe to their home district and get reelected. In the House of Representatives, one representative is supposed to represent about 800,000 people. That's how representative they are, i.e., not whatsoever. So yeah, they've developed this mentality, especially due to their proximity to power and involvement in the deep state, of not having to answer to you as the electorate, especially in these sorts of stories that could paint the U.S. administration and administrations in a negative light.
Their total unwillingness to protect this country domestically, to protect the people who live here, to protect the territorial integrity of the country, bringing in tens of millions of people illegally, giving them free stuff the second they get here, making a mockery of citizenship. I hated all of that. I hated all of that. But the thing I hated most was their total unwillingness to answer any question about why they were doing what they were doing, because it was just too insulting. And every single time I would just feel like raising the middle finger and screaming obscenities, which is not an adult response, I'll concede, but that's how I felt. And I think that's really at the heart of why the Epstein thing is so distressing. I mean, the guy was some weird sex freak who was abusing girls. We knew that. But the fact that the US government, the one that I voted for, refused to take my question seriously and instead said, case closed, shut up, conspiracy theorist, was too much for me. And I don't think the rest of us should be satisfied with that. And by the way, let me just say really quickly, because I was so mad about it that I think I found out part of what's going on. I think we are going to find out more. And I think the truth, for whatever it's worth, in case you're interested, is that the DOJ didn't release lots of incriminating sex videos with Epstein and his billionaire pals because they don't have them. They don't have them because when the original search warrant was served, 2007, I think, possibly 2006, I think 7, it was basically designed to protect Epstein.
Okay, so a few things on this. First of all, I'm with Tucker on that mentality toward getting answers on this, regardless of who's in power. Unfortunately, a lot of the pro-Trump people do not seem to care about this, want this to just die. Trump himself at that press conference acted extremely defensive in saying, why are you asking a question about Epstein? 24 hours after that DOJ and FBI release, did an about face on basically everything the administration had said. I'm going to have to partially disagree with Tucker here. He is right that 2007 information that he's referring to, I think it was actually 2006. I could be wrong on that. But that arrest, where he eventually got a sweetheart deal, did seem to be designed to protect Epstein. But as far as the video material being non-existent, that just isn't true. And we know that for several reasons. Two, biggest of all, is that, number one, in 2018, when the FBI raided Epstein's properties, they found within his bathroom a safe. And in that safe contained lots of digital media, CDs, ostensibly recorded on his CCTVs he had all over his properties, that were labeled with the following: Young, the word Young, X, which is the name of presumably a girl, plus name, like Y, presumably the person he was extracting blackmail information from. We know this existed. Moreover, a New York Times reporter admitted, off the record, a few days after Epstein's death, that Epstein told him in confidence that he had information regarding the sexual proclivities and drug activity of various prominent people throughout the world. Now, the simple rejoinder to this is, hey, you're trusting the New York Times all of a sudden after bashing them so long? No, I don't trust the New York Times. I'm saying that the New York Times, above and foremost, in addition to the CIA and other deep state entities, are more likely to cover stuff up like this, especially when the government is implicated. And because they're divulging this, what else could be below the surface? Moreover, at the beginning of this, it wasn't quite clear about how this would be politicized and how far-reaching this sex ring was. We've learned more about it at the time, and I think there was more likelihood to get better knowledge at the beginning. So on that, I have to disagree with Tucker. The rest of his point stands, I think.
The search warrant was written in such a way to make sure that the feds never got their hands on the actually incriminating evidence. It's another way of saying the cover-up has been going on since 2007, almost 20 years. And so the real question is not, was Jeffrey Epstein a weirdo who was abusing girls? Yes, we can answer that. The real question is, why was he doing this, on whose behalf, and where did the money come from?
Yeah, one other addition is another piece of evidence for the videos is that at one point Pam Bondi said there were thousands of hours of Epstein molesting children. She didn't say child porn. That's how it's being spun now, is at that press conference all of a sudden said, well, it was child porn. He had downloaded it or whatever, and we're never going to release it. And by the way, no one ever asked for it to be released. So she was actually talking to people as if they wanted that exploitative material, which no one of repute ever asked for. But guess what we would like? We would like the FBI to take a look at that and document who the individuals are that engaged in that wrongdoing, in those crimes, and those vile, heinous activities, such that we can see who it is and judge for ourselves if they had connections to Jeffrey Epstein. That's something they won't do for us. But Tucker's right about the real question that stands is, who is he working for?
And those are the questions that need to be answered. And I think it's entirely fair to ask them. And it's not adequate to say anyone who asked them is somehow desecrating the memory of little girls who died in Texas. I'm not going to put up with that answer. I don't care who gives that answer. That is not acceptable. And I think the real answer is Jeffrey Epstein was working on behalf of intel services, probably not American. And we have every right to ask, on whose behalf was he working? How does a guy go from being a math teacher at the Dalton School in the late 70s with no college degree to having multiple airplanes, a private island, and the largest residential house in Manhattan? Where did all the money come from? And no one has ever gotten to the bottom of that because no one has ever tried.
Yeah, he's mostly right about that. We know of some of the ways he's gotten that money. It's through direct transfers from people like Les Wexner and others, Leon Black, that gave him money to do his taxes to the tune of Leon Black about $150 million, presumably to do his taxes. This guy was incredible at doing taxes. And Les Wexner giving him, maybe over $100 million of various properties, including that $77 million Manhattan home, the biggest private residential address in Manhattan. Tucker's right about that. So we know some of it, but when he died, he was apparently worth about $560 million. And some media publications referred to him at the zenith of his wealth as a billionaire. So yeah, where did he get that? I think the most likely answer is payments from Israeli intelligence services, presumably Israeli, and or blackmail payments from prominent people. I think that's how he got most of his money outside of what we know.
And moreover, it's extremely obvious to anyone who watches that this guy had direct connections to a foreign government. Now, no one's allowed to say that that foreign government is Israel because we have been somehow cowed into thinking that that's naughty. There is nothing wrong with saying that. There is nothing hateful about saying that. There's nothing anti-Semitic about saying that. There's nothing even anti-Israel about saying that. I've spent my entire life pretty much in Washington, where I knew and loved a number of people, including one very close person who worked at CIA. That has never prohibited me from saying, I think the CIA has done some horrible things, murdered a bunch of people, participated in the murder of a sitting US president. It's got a whole trail of crimes. That doesn't make me a disloyal American. It doesn't make me anti-American in any sense. I was born here. My family's been here for hundreds of years. I love this country. That's why I live here.
Yeah, to say that makes you sane. It means that you use reason rather than tribalism to dictate your thoughts and feelings and sensibilities. That's what that means. So yeah, totally with Tucker on that. You know, you're not allowed to say Israel. I'm very glad that the Turning Point USA crowd he's talking to right now, you know, mostly cheered for that. That is telling about where the right is moving to some extent on these things, at least the populist right. Now, there are going to be diehard establishment Zionist types, including some in that audience that probably didn't want to speak out because, you know, Tucker is so prominent on the right, probably the biggest figure of prominence on the right in general, other than Trump right now. And to get that kind of response is a good thing. It shows that the right is moving in a more logical direction regarding the U.S. relationship with Israel and criticizing Israel, which it would be just unheard of to do this 20 years ago, I think.
So criticizing the behavior of a government agency does not make you a hater. It makes you a free person. It makes you a citizen. You're allowed to do that because you're not a slave. You're a citizen. And you have a right to expect that your government will not act against your interests, and you have a right to demand that foreign governments not be allowed to act against your interests. That's not creepy. It shouldn't be forbidden. And yet all of us have trained ourselves to believe that you can't say that somehow, that that's like too naughty and forbidden. And the effect of making that off limits has been to create a lot of resentment, and I'll say it, hate online.
Yeah, I have to agree. When the excuse for every legitimate critique of U.S. policy toward Israel or Israel and their doings is that you're just an anti-Semite, do you think that that will be better than the alternative? So will you create more anti-Semitism by doing that, by just lumping everyone into that bucket? I think you will. I think that that is a reason for, you know, the supposed rise of anti-Semitism, which I don't completely buy. I mean, I think you do see that to some extent on social media, but I think it's driven by that kind of behavior where everything you don't like is anti-Semitic, just like, again, the woke liberals did everything that I don't like is racist or sexist or homophobic. It's that and actual critiques of what Israel's doing in Gaza. Israel is pretending to be the representatives of Jewish people in general by some of these narratives. And if they are, and people swallow that, then they're going to believe that this is vile. And that's, you know, what Jews do. And I don't believe that, by the way. Some of my most prominent influences politically are Jews today living too. Glenn Greenwald and Dave Smith and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal and Jeffrey Sachs, and some of my historical influences like Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. So many of them are actual Jewish. But at the same time, you can see how these impulses drive that sort of mentality in our culture.
Where people feel like they can't just say, like, what the hell is this? You have the former Israeli prime minister living in your house. You have had all this contact with the foreign government. Were you working on behalf of Mossad? Were you running a blackmail operation on behalf of a foreign government? By the way, every single person in Washington, D.C. thinks that. I've never met anyone who doesn't think that. I don't know any of them that hate Israel, but no one feels they can say that. Why? And I think the longer that we play along with it, the more subterranean and creepy and hateful the conversation actually becomes. So I think it's better just to say it right out loud. Did this happen? And of course, that question has been asked to the government of Israel, and their answer is, we're not going to tell you. And I think our answer should be, no. As long as we're sending you money, if you were committing crimes on our soil, we have an absolute right to know, did you do this or not?
Absolutely. I'm so glad he is driving this point home to this crowd, because, yeah, that's absolutely the response we need to have to Israel, and threaten to withhold the aid. That's what we would do if we're actually a sovereign country that is behaving in an America First manner, where our sovereignty matters more than anything else, that we're the focal point, not this foreign government that we're subsidizing the warfare of and the genocide of. That's what we would actually do. We would threaten to withhold the funding unless you provide those kind of answers. And in a very documented form, by the way. And he's also right about Ehud Barak, who was the former prime minister and chief of Mossad that lived with Epstein for prolonged periods and visited him 30 times. This is well documented. That's not a conspiracy theory either. And that's a pretty ironclad connection to both Israel and its intelligence service.
And yet everybody has been so brainwashed into thinking that's somehow an expression of hate or bigotry, when it's not. It's a baseline question that every U.S. citizen has a right to an answer on. What the hell was this? And by the way, if it turns out that it was nothing at all, that somehow Jeffrey Epstein really did earn $165 million giving tax advice to somebody, which is, for the record, a lot more than most people pay their accountants, and that none of this was actually a foreign intel operation, and that there was no blackmail involved, that actually Bill Gates was just hanging on the island because the weather was especially good. No one was videotaped doing anything immoral or illegal, and then that was used against them to get them to obey. If all of that is false, then just tell me how it's false. But don't call me a lunatic. And when Fox News runs a piece, as they did yesterday by Hugh Hewitt, saying that anybody who's got even more questions about Epstein is some kind of nutcase with an unhappy personal life, who's spending too much time on Twitter in the fervid fever swamps of conspiracies.
Yeah, like I said, it's uncanny, the resemblance between the regime response to asking legitimate questions about this compared to the COVID regime and the Russiagate hoax. If you happen to disagree or point to contradictory evidence that disposed of the federal narrative regarding these things, you were called a conspiracy theorist, a loon, a moron, and that's what the regime right is doing right now on this. It just is a tribal impulse, too, because some of the people doing this were particularly adamant that exposing this Epstein information would bury the Democrats, would, destroy the deep state that was persecuting Trump for so long. Over specious reasons, by the way. That's exactly what Russiagate was, a total absurd hoax. So that's what we're dealing with here, and Tucker's exactly right to liken that to those impulses that we hated so much.
Up yours, buddy. Then why don't you answer the question then? Don't let anybody insult you, anybody, and I mean anybody, ever get away with insulting you instead of answering a legitimate question. Okay? Ever. And by the way, you will hear certain people say, well, that means you hate the person. No, it doesn't. I've got a bunch of kids. I would never let them get away with that. If I caught one of my kids, smoking weed in the bathroom at my house, and I was like, are you smoking weed in the bathroom? Shut up, racist. You hate me. No, you're my child. I don't hate you. Answer the freaking question. Were you smoking weed in the bathroom or not? I'm not the criminal here. You seem to be. So I just think it's really important to get into that headspace. And even now, when people talk about this topic, I can promise you, since I spent all day on the phone yesterday on this topic with informed people, they're like whispering certain words. And I'm like, why are we whispering? Why should I be ashamed as an American about wanting to know what the hell that just was?
Yeah, pretty interesting comparison there by Tucker, but an apt one. By asking these questions, it doesn't make you, an enemy of America, clearly. It makes you a patriot trying to seek out answers and transparency when, I don't know, a global sex trafficking ring is being covered up that involves some of the most powerful people in the world. And we were told by many of Trump's supporters how transparent this administration would be in comparison to Biden. Trump would be a white knight marching into Washington under that triumph, winning a second term, and divulge all the information that they had been concealing so long. Well, instead of that, we got that ploy in February by Bondi signing up a bunch of conservative influencers to come out to the White House, handing them binders full of documents that were already released that said the Epstein files phase 1. Within that even implying that there would be a phase 2. Fast forward, 4 or 5 months later, and oh yeah, there's not going to be a phase 2. Now, I did see stories today that I am following, both that Ghislaine Maxwell is apparently willing to talk to Congress about some of the information related to that ring. That's an interesting story. I fear that she might then just end up like Epstein now. Potentially, if that goes forward. I don't think it's going to go forward. I think they really want to bury this because it implicates people from both sides. But also that supposedly Laura Trump and Charlie Kirk revealed that after their discussions with Trump and administration officials about the pushback to the Epstein situation, is that they will be releasing additional information about Epstein. Now, I'm not holding my tongue or holding my breath on that at all. I think that the biggest likelihood is they'll release more information that has already been released to the public about this, or even, try to legitimize this thing by setting up a farcical, Warren Commission style committee to study this and eventually determine that the government has investigated the government and has found that the government is culpable for zero wrongdoing. And guess who they'll put as chairman, if my prediction holds? Someone like James Clapper, or Mike Pompeo, or James Comey, or Robert Mueller. You can just call these things out, before they happen because it's so absurd. They cover for each other, they cover up and protect, and it's a bipartisan affair. And it's so bipartisan that even the theatrics that they put on display for all of us in the run-up to these elections, the supposed clash of ideologies between Harris and Trump, despite all that, the two sides ultimately are part of the same uniparty, the same deep state, and they often cover for each other. And I think that's what we're seeing now. There's not a better explanation than that. I think Tucker's reasoning for Epstein working for Mossad is plausible. That's probably the most plausible explanation for who he was working for, not only in how he obtained his money, who he obtained it from, Les Wexner and Ehud Barak and Robert Maxwell. These associations are all very closely aligned with the Israeli government. That, in addition to what Alexander Acosta said before he gave, actually not before, but after he gave Epstein his sweetheart deal, he said, I was told that Epstein was part of intelligence and he was above my pay grade. That's part of the documented record on this case. So those things combined all fit puzzles individually of pieces of a puzzle together to create a narrative that sounds most plausible, and that is that he was an Israeli intelligent asset, most likely. And I can't say that categorically. I don't have the smoking gun in front of me, but I don't think it's crazy to lay these facts out, show them to people, because the mainstream media isn't doing that, and get them to come to their own conclusions. But that does seem to be plausible. But I do want to hear from you on that. Is Tucker Carlson right on this? And is the right shifting to a more anti-Israeli opinion in matters such as Iran and the Epstein case? Let me know in the comments below. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to Tucker Carlson too. He's doing a great job bringing these issues up. Even where I think he gets some things wrong, he's very courageous to take this thing on from the right. And please consider supporting me by becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you'll support the channel financially, and you'll get access to all my videos before they release live on YouTube. With that said, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Take care, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.